So for evidence of evolution, first of all, I think I mentioned this in last week's video, but I want to go over it again. Just some really basic stuff when we talk about literal special creation, right? That's young Earth. Everything was created exactly as described in Genesis, and that's literal special creation. We have evolutionary theory, which is a change in populations over time, where we have a common ancestor and populations diverging from one another as we go through time from that common ancestor. We have things like Lamarckian theory, which is the idea that organisms acquire traits, and those acquired traits get passed on. So the giraffe's neck gets stretched out by eating from the tops of trees, and then when they have an offspring, the baby giraffe has a longer neck because the parent had been stretching that neck all its life. And then finally, intelligent design, which is life is too complex to be evolved, therefore it must have been designed. So we're going to just kind of think about these different evidences of evolution in the context of those different ideas. And primarily, we're going to look at evolutionary theory versus literal creation. So if we were to look at the forelimbs, right, of differing species, we should see that there's no need for them to be similar, right? In fact, we see forelimbs all the time that are different, right? If we were to compare the limbs of an arthropod of some kind, right? The forelimbs of them, they're nothing in common with the forelimbs of a human. An insect is what I was thinking there. But when we compare a wing, an arm, and a flipper, right? And again, we see flippers that look nothing like a human arm. We see wings that look nothing like a human arm. But when we look at a group of mammals that have an arm, a wing, and a flipper, we see a pattern that emerges. One bone, two bones, the wrist and phalanges. One bone, two bones, the wrist, phalanges. One bone, two bone, the wrist bones right there, and phalanges. Why would these things be that way? They're completely different structures. It would be absurd to design them that way. It would be a waste of your time. But if they evolved, if they came from the same common ancestor who had that basic one bone, two bone, wrist phalanges pattern, and then through selection had these features altered through selection and mutation, now we're starting to have something that makes more sense, right? And so that's one of the strong evolution evidences of evolution is homology, that we see these things. And sometimes those things don't make sense. We see similarity that isn't likely due to common ancestry. We can see very distinct species have similar functions, like, for example, sharks and dolphins, very similar body forms. But even that, when we start to analyze it, it's actually, that similarity is not as close as we might think. When a shark goes swimming through the water, it swims side to side. That's the way it pushes its tail fin to project itself through the ocean. How does a dolphin swim through the ocean? Front to back. It moves its tail up and down. So they have this aquatic lifestyle with sleek, missile-shaped bodies. They live in the ocean, and yet they swim entirely differently. They acquire oxygen entirely differently. The gills are bringing it in for the shark, whereas the dolphin has lungs. That all of a sudden, that similarity that made us think that sharks and dolphins must are really similar to each other starts to fall apart, right? That similarity is not really there. It's not true. And when you start to look at dolphins specifically being mammals, right, we can actually even look at and compare them to other land organisms. So, and see this path from side to side flexion at the hip to front to back flexion. Like, for example, if you've ever watched a slow moving reptile, right? Their arms are out like this. It's like they're doing a push-up all the time. and they move their bodies this way, right? Side to side to move forward. The slow part is just, it makes it more dramatic, that motion. You can actually see it really well. So they're moving side to side to get that. Well, at some point in time, right, this is really energetically costly to have your limbs out to the side like this. But if you can take and put those limbs more directly under the body and in a way that you can lock, now all of a sudden that's less energetically costly. But we can't move side to side. Now we've lost some of that motion, that range that motion gives us. Now we're kind of locked, right? Well, by having it directly under us now, well, if we're a four-limbed animal down on all fours, now all of a sudden, if we can move that hip front to back, we change that the way those muscles and bones align. Now all of a sudden we can move really quickly with that front to back flexion. And that's something we see when we move into mammals, right? Mammals are the ones that have that style body arrangement away from the reptiles. Well, that then all of a sudden we can understand why dolphins have that front to back hip flexion in their swimming, right? Because they inherited that from a common ancestor with other mammals. And so this thing that didn't necessarily make sense, analogy is not really what we'd predict with evolution until we start to understand, oh, it's the common environment that's selected for some of these features to look the same. But when we analyze them, they're actually quite different and align with some of the common ancestry that goes with the synapomorphies of like hair and mammary glands that we see with other mammals. So again, it starts out as, oh, that seems like a question, and then it actually turns into an even stronger evidence of evolution. Law of superposition, this is kind of getting at how rock layers form and how that ties to where we find fossils and the age of those fossils that we find them. And so we can see what have been termed, missing links, right? We'd expect to see transition fossils throughout this period where we have ancient species slowly becoming more and more like modern species. And so we can see some of those things when we look at hominids, right? Like Homo ergaster here, right? If you found that skull, you'd probably think that was human until you started looking more closely and you see, wait a second, that guy's jaw comes forward at his nose. He doesn't really have a nasal bone, and look at that brow ridge, that's huge. But man, if you were comparing this to a chimpanzee, it'd be a lot closer to a human than a chimpanzee. So that's that idea of a transition fossil. An Archaeopteryx, right, has many features of a dinosaur, big long tail. Birds don't have a bony tail like that. They can have feather tails, but they don't have a big long bony tail like that. We have one bone, two bone wrist action going on here with phalanges coming out, claws. We have a jaw instead of a beak. Right? This is a very dinosaur looking fossil, except it has wings with feathers coming out. Nice transition fossil for us. DNA, well, hopefully we'll understand this better in future lessons as we kind of study the process of how DNA works. But essentially, your DNA is interpreted the same way that a bacteria interprets its DNA. Well, why would that be the case? Unless a common ancestor developed that way of interpreting DNA and it was passed on to all living organisms. We can also see some similarities in the structure of the DNA. We'll learn more about the structure in future lessons as well, but these A's, T's, G's, and C's kind of carry the information of the DNA. It forms a double helix that twists around itself, and those double helix get coiled up around proteins called histones, and those histones coil up around themselves, and we get this structure that ultimately forms a chromosome. Well, we can take a look at those chromosomes, and we can see patterns in them, where genes are located and where they're not located. That's what that banding is. We can compare these chromosomes. These chromosomes all come from a human. I mean, they have two of each type. We'll learn about that in the future. And banding patterns are, of course, similar because they have the same genes. That's why they're in these pairs like they are. You have two of chromosome number 1 and all the genes that are associated with that, and so on. We can compare those banding patterns between different species and see that banding pattern. The more closely related they are, the more similar that banding pattern is. And so that's another great example of that. We can see it here with humans, chimps, gorillas, and orangutans, right? That banding pattern is really similar. And as we get less and less close to humans, we get maybe more divergence, but still there's a lot of similarity there. Okay. So DNA, both the universal genetic code and the structure of the DNA, helps us, gives us evidence of common ancestry. All right. Next, we have vestigial structures. These are structures that pretty much everyone in the species has, but they don't appear to serve a function. And the question is, why would someone design or create them if there was no reason for them to exist? So, for example, we have the fact that you can goosebumps. You have little muscles called erector pili that attach to your hair, and they contract. When they contract your hair, instead of lying down, stands up on end. It's a really common feature among all furred organisms, but humans aren't furred. So why would we have that structure if we never had that function? Think about what this means for a furred organism. When it's cold outside, a common time you might get goosebumps. Well, if you're furred, you just picked up an extra thick coat by having the hair stand up on end. When you're scared, when you feel like you might be attacked, you can make yourself look larger by having your fur stand up on end. And in fact, you can increase the thickness of the layer that the attacker might have to bite through, which provides you some protection. So that's another classic example of a vestigial structure, right? It doesn't have a function, but it's there in all of us. The appendix, it probably kills more people than anything, right? Not anything. It kills more people than it would ever be worth. There is some studies that there might be some bacterial function to it, but those are not greatly supported, and it definitely isn't necessary for you to live, because you can live without them. Lots of people do. And so, yeah, doesn't seem to have a purpose. But that same structure in some herbivores allows them to digest grass. Common ancestor passed it on, still serves a function in them or a different function in them. It doesn't really serve a function in us. It's a leftover. Leg bones attached to hip bones in a whale. You don't have legs. Why do you have hip bones and leg bones? That's a common ancestor passed those on. The tailbone, it only exists to cause us pain. Why would we have the instructions to make the vertebrae for tail, or make the vertebrae for a tail, if we were designed that way? Doesn't really make sense, but it does make sense if we had a common ancestor that had a tail, and the instructions for making those were on, but were modified to cause them to be fused into coccyx. Atavisms, even stranger, right? Take a look. This kid has a tail. The instructions for making a tail are inside all of us, but they have been, through genetic regulation and mutation, turned off. They no longer function for most of us. You actually do form a tail at one point in your life. Almost everyone does. There's just some genes that turn on that cause it to be reabsorbed and not fully formed. This kid has some mutations that have allowed that gene to be expressed again. Mammals. In other mammals that have multiple nipples or multiple lines of nipples, they have a milk line that goes down the abdomen. They have nipples all the way down that abdomen. Why would someone have the genes already in them for making extra nipples? Unless a common ancestor also had those, and they typically aren't expressed in humans. So atavisms are a great evidence of evolution, because they show us that we have genes within us that aren't expressed. They're turned off, but they're still there. The instructions are there, and with the right mutation, they can be reactivated. And that's an atavism. Embryonic development. If we were to look at this, right, this is all about that same 5 to 6 week period for those embryos. There's a lot of homology happening here. And in embryonic development, it is crucial to get things right. If you get things out of order, it can cause massive problems. This is probably the easiest place for mutations to affect an organism. But look, there's the tail I told you about earlier. All of these guys have tails. The chicken's tail is actually even smaller than ours. You'll develop what we call pharyngeal gill slits. Every human does. That's not gills, it's gill slits, openings for gills. Why would we have the instructions for that and have it be part of our embryonic development? Doesn't make sense. All of these creatures get that embryonic gill slit. Nothing in here ever gets gills. So why would those be there if we're designed? Seems like a wasteful design.